Hey guys, it is April 10th, 2018. I'm going to get the Q&A done. It's now Tuesday, even though I posted this on Sunday. Things have been really crazy, so I'm going to try to get through it all here. Topic this week was training, so pretty much wide open. A lot of good questions, I thought. I was actually pretty excited for this one. So first one, get through it. Best protocol for calf gains. Save the world from small calves. All right. So, in general, I think calves respond to volume, frequency, just overall density of training. So, and and I kind of attribute that to certain muscle groups. I kind of attribute that to probably fiber type. There's could be some science behind the fiber type thing. I mean, I know that's some people look into fiber type training as far as rep sets and how you would structure certain muscle groups. But I do think there is some validity to that, especially in certain muscle groups like calves that are used excessively. So most people and anyone that's had success growing their calves from poor to mediocre calf genetics would probably agree that literally training them often as possible is pretty much the way to go. Now, with that said, you obviously, if you're training them to the point where your feet are sore and you can't even contract your calves, then you're not recovering. But using a variety of rep ranges and just training them on the days that you are in the gym, I do find is beneficial. I like to have people rotate rep schemes. It's kind of what I do with myself too. My calves have grown; they're still not good. I have those really high calf inserts. That's a whole different subject, the way the actual muscle belly is. But training them with different rep ranges, actually progressively overloading your calves. This might sound silly, but I went through a phase where, with calves, I think a lot of the time people are just constantly focused on full stretch, full contraction, full stretch, full contraction, which is good because the short little bouncy calf reps that aren't really training, aren't really giving you full activation. Probably not the best thing anyhow. But I do find that actually trying to use a sufficient amount of weight with your calves is also beneficial. That doesn't have to be the primary type of training, but I think it's important to do it. I will use regular hypertrophy rep ranges, 8 reps for calves with a little bit heavier weight. And I'm still doing full range of motion, but again, I'm still am doing a heavier weight. I actually went through a phase where I used, if anyone's familiar with like the DC calf type protocol, where it's very long set. Essentially, you have pauses at the flexion. You have pauses in the stretch position. They're slow eccentrics. The set's very, very long. One working set. I actually went through and I would try to increase the weight each week that I used and keep the form tight. I found that the results were pretty decent. So again, progressively overloading there. I will use cell swelling type of work. I think that's important for calves. I think it is important to do at least some high rep work for calves, just because, again, going back to that fiber type deal. So really mixing up all of the rep ranges, and then of course training them frequently every training day. Perhaps start your training session with calves. All right. Personal experience, what's giving you the best results for shoulder growth? And there's another question too, and I'll answer both of these. When you're looking at large amounts of shoulder growth during a long time of surplus, are you comfortable with hitting them really hard, heavy, and giving them their own day of the week instead of, say, just a push day, have them separated shoulder day? Or would you potentially be too worried about injury? Okay, so I think shoulders, kind of like calves, respond to high density of training for people that struggle with them. Um, Again, going back to the theory of the muscles, it is used very often. I mean, anytime your arm is moving, the shoulder joint is moving back, forward, side, it's always moving anytime you're using your arms. So with that, I wouldn't necessarily say they need their own day, though you could train them on their own day. Just total volume is going to be more important. We're going to talk about volume a little bit more down in another question. But, I mean, total volume is going to be more important than necessarily training them on their own day. If you want to train them on their own day, you could. But, again, you could train them 3 days a week and still get the total volume that you needed split up. I would say that it really just depends on how they recover the best. If you're doing one day and they're really beat up, and their joints sore, whatever, then maybe that's not best. If you're doing high frequency and that's actually impeding recovery, then maybe that's not the best way to go about it. But again, just hitting them with sufficient volume, prioritizing them in that way is probably going to be the most important thing. And you say really hard and heavy. Yeah, I mean, actually progressively overloading with shoulders. People get too fancy. Not that the exercises are fancy, but they're so worried about just everything slow, control, contract, blow the shoulders up, get them pumped. And they rarely even progressively overload their shoulders in any way. They don't add reps. They don't add weight. And while I do think it's not necessarily the best thing to just be slinging around weight, I mean, you do need to, you don't want to ignore that whole entire component of progressive overload in there as well. So volume and progressive overload, just like any muscle. But with the shoulders, I think a lot of people just don't use sufficient weight. Now with that, you have to obviously find exercises that are going to be safe. Shoulder injuries are very common. So finding exercises that you can progressively overload on, that you feel pretty secure in, that you can perform well, range of motion's good, just the whole movement pattern feels good to you, and that might be different person to person. Maybe it is just a traditional overhead press with a barbell. Maybe you need to do an overhead press dead stop out of a rack from nose height. Maybe that feels more secure to you. Maybe you are doing upright rows with dumbbells. I like those versus a barbell. That's just a personal preference. Maybe you're just doing dumbbell overhead presses. Maybe you're using a machined overhead press. Maybe you're not overhead pressing at all. But again, I mean, you still don't want to ignore the whole component of progressive overload there, along with prioritizing them volume-wise as well. And I would probably say I use slightly higher rep ranges with shoulders normally. That kind of goes into the density thing. Not all the time, but just in general. Okay. How do you approach training less than 4 weeks out? Adjust volume, frequency, intensity, listening to your body. So yeah, I mean, you are going to need to listen to your body, really. It's going to be a matter of how do you feel, what's your nervous system feel like, where are you at in your prep, how lean are you, what do you look like. There obviously becomes a point in prep where you just need to be intelligent, not be a moron. And if you do lose a little bit of strength, it's not really a big deal, especially as you get very close to a show. If somebody's losing strength 2 weeks out, I really don't care. In most cases, it's not that big of a deal at that point. But, there's a couple things you want to remember here. So you mentioned volume, frequency, and intensity. Okay, so volume, there's some literature to suggest that you could cut back your volume if you still were training intensely enough, you're going to preserve tissue. So I think that that's an option in some cases, and then in other cases, that might be a bad option because you're going to decrease your caloric expenditure too much, and that's going to throw off your fat loss. While training is not necessarily the primary way that we're creating a deficit, you still have to figure, you're burning calories while you train. So if you cut your volume in half, then you're losing all that caloric expenditure. So that's something to consider. Frequency, that kind of ties into volume, frequency and volume together. It's more about total volume, not necessarily frequency. Intensity is going to really depend on nervous system. And you're not gaining any muscle 4 weeks out. You're probably not gaining any muscle in prep, and in very rare cases there might be some minimal lean body mass gain somewhere, but that's not your primary goal in a prep. So with that, the intensity doesn't need to be absolutely smashing yourself. I mean, there can be failure points in the training, that's okay, but there's no point in excessive failure training to burning out your CNS when there's literally no benefit to it whatsoever. Because again, you're not going to be gaining any muscle anyhow, so it doesn't really matter. With that said, it's going to be, like I said, there's a couple things to remember with the volume there and the intensity, but in general, I try to honestly keep it as consistent as I can. So it's not messing with caloric expenditure. I can do movement patterns that I can hold my strength on pretty well. Even if I'm not gaining strength, I know that I can at least go in there and probably maintain or close. I have some point of reference. I'm not changing my exercises all the time. It's boring, but I'm comfortable with it, and I can focus on my nutrition and cardio or whatever that's helping me lose body fat at that point. Okay, let's see. On the recent Restpause versus straight sets research, do you prefer to accrue volume with straight sets at a lower RP per set versus, say, a cluster set like a muscle round with a relative higher intensity per bout? What I prefer and what somebody else prefers is going to be different. And the reason is recovery, nervous system primarily. The problem I have with some research like this is it doesn't take into account at all the outside environmental factors of what the person's life is going to be like. How do they recover? What's their nervous system like? Is it practical? Well, it might be better on paper to do a cluster set or a muscle round versus straight sets. Do those higher intensity bouts actually work better for each person? No. Why? Because we know that one person's recovery ability from a CNS standpoint is going to be entirely different from somebody else's. There's really no way for them to research that just because there's so much individual variability. They're giving you research that says, in general, the largest amount of the population probably will do best with this. And that's kind of what it's giving us. Because they have a group that they study, whatever amount of people it is, that work best for the majority of the group or largest percentage. So, me personally, it's gonna totally depend on the person. A couple things it depends on. The person's nervous system recovery. Do I want to add more? Do I want to add more sets to failure in the workout? Do I want to save those failure sets for exercises that we're really trying to push progressive overload on, that they might need to go to failure to actually be able to add weight to the bar? Maybe they can't use an RP of 9 on those, squats or dumbbell presses again this week because they're not going to be able to progressively overload at all. So maybe they do need to go to failure and push a little bit harder to get that to progressively overload. Now, at that point, how much do they have left in the tank CNS-wise to put towards their volume work? If somebody has a great CNS, great recovery in that regard, then I might have them do more. I might have them do more failure bouts. And even with stuff like a muscle round or cluster sets or rest pauses or whatever, even with the straight sets that aren't maximal RPs, you can still progressively overload there. You can still add the volume and overload at the same time. So it's not to say that you can't, but if I have the training split up in a real basic way that says these are probably going to be the movements that you're going to be able to overload best on, these are probably going to be the movements that are going to be a little bit more difficult to overload on just because they're lighter movements. The percentage, the amount of weight that you'd realistically be able to add is pretty minimal. So let's not kill ourselves on these sets, these small sets, and accrue volume through those at a sub-maximal intensity. And let's save our CNS for these larger sets where we can progressively overload better, more potential to do so. And that's kind of how I'm splitting it up. But then you also have to take into consideration metabolic stressors. There is that component to training as well that is beneficial. So some of those things like muscle rounds, for example, might have a benefit towards the metabolic stress side of things with the shorter rest periods and yada, yada, yada. So again, you kind of see how I'm splitting it up. Like what makes more sense to overload, what makes more sense to accrue volume with. Is there going to be benefit to training to failure in our primary volume work or not? And that will come down to the person's recovery. I hope that made sense. I think it did. Oh boy. Who would win in a fight? No, sorry. Who would win in a pillow fight between Lyle and Sumi Sign? I'm not even sure who that is. They keep mentioning him. I have no idea who he is. I don't know. For the purpose of scoring the fight, chalky handprints are to be disregarded. Oh, man. I don't know. I don't know this other guy, so that's the problem. I know Lyle is a very angry man, so I mean, I would assume he'd probably fight to the death, but I'm not sure who this other guy is. I feel like I'm way out of the loop. I can't give a good answer on this. It'd actually be really good for celebrity deathmatch. I don't know if you guys had that in the UK, but the little clay people that fought in the ring, that was actually a really hilarious show. That was it was pretty raunchy. I know they took it off the air, but that was a pretty good show. That would be a good match. Okay. So this next one kind of plays into the previous one about accruing volume, but we'll go ahead and do this. Given the current literature seems to favor volume as main driver for hypertrophy, what has been your experience as far as individuals' response to higher volume, lower RPE versus lower volume, higher RPE? Okay. My opinion on this has changed a little bit over the years. I truthfully feel, I feel like with confidence I can say I do lean more towards at least moderate volume. I've kind of gotten away from the super low volume, all high RPEs type of training. And the only reason I say that is because, well, one of the main reasons I say that is because I just don't find from a nervous system standpoint that it's practical for people to do and keep recovering from. You're missing the whole entire volume component there, which we know is a driver for hypertrophy. But we've seen it time and time again that guys have used programs like DC training and had great results. They get strong as hell, they grow, but it's not going to be practical to recover. Recovery is not going to be practical for everyone. So again, speaking on the most amount of people that I can lump into it, I would say I at least lean towards moderate volume. And then, obviously there's going to be variance within person to person. I would probably, because there's no moderate volume choice on here, because me personally, I don't train higher volume. I would say my volume's moderate. It's sufficient. It's minimum effective volume or a little bit more sometimes, for me personally. And I wouldn't say my RPEs are lower necessarily, but I mean, not all my training is max effort. I do have a lot of submaximal training as well. I just sprinkle in the max effort sets where I see appropriate, and you can reference back to the question a couple questions ago where I mentioned where it might be appropriate to do so. So that's kind of my opinion on that for the largest number of people. There is some follow-up comments on here. Let's see if I need to touch on any of these, just because just adds a little bit of context. So with that, it says all the literature showing this had sufficient intensity as a prerequisite. All right. So when they say higher volume with lower RPE, it's not like you're doing an RPE of 3 or 4. There's still sufficient intensity as a prerequisite for making, for muscular adaptations, I guess you could say. There has to be at least enough intensity for any kind of adaptation to occur, or it's not going to matter. You're just going through the motions. You're just doing cardio at that point, burning calories. Um, there, I don't think it says, okay, so I don't think it says actually how many, they're talking about reps in reserve here in the comments. And I don't know that there's any research that actually says this many reps in reserve is what you need to train to for sufficient volume. It's it's hard to say, but I would say sufficient. When I consider sufficient, I'm talking probably 2 to 3 reps in reserve. So the way that I would look at training, referencing that question again, would be my volume accruing sets are submaximal, but I'm still looking at an RP of maybe 8, maybe a 9 here and there. Probably not a lot of 9s, more 8s, maybe a couple 7s in there. So kind of that 7 to 8 range. So again, there's still sufficient intensity. They're not easy sets. It's not like I'm just, it's not like I'm just curling 5-pound dumbbells. I mean, there's still sufficient intensity within those sets. And that's kind of what they're referencing here. Building volume. Yeah. So like someone says, I can see an argument for building volume around the RP 8 mark. I agree with that totally. I think that that's a decent way to build volume with sufficient intensity, and then saving the max effort sets for the times that may be more beneficial, like I mentioned before. I think that's probably the best way I can answer that question without having individual context, just because, again, all of it really breaks down to recovery ability mainly from a CNS standpoint, and we just really can't measure that, because it would be very hard to control those lifestyle variables of every single person in the study. And even if they did, it wouldn't really make a difference, because everyone's genetically, I guess, is gonna vary anyhow in that regard. All right, and those are some really good thought-provoking questions. I like those. So hopefully that was some practical answer. Give you something that you can apply. So considering now I have some sort of bulging or herniated discs, pro bodybuilder recently said he doesn't know many that barbell squat anymore. Hack squats, leg press, Smith machine, lunges are fine for leg growth. Thoughts? I mean, yeah, there's not any exercise that you have to do. Not to say that you can't grow without any of those exercises. I think structurally and biomechanically, some people are definitely more suited for certain exercises than others. So that's something to consider, even if you're not injured. I mean, for squatting, for example, I have kind of short femurs. I feel like squatting suits me okay. Like I do fine with it. It might be a little bit different for somebody, or we might have to adjust the way that they squat, maybe the depth they squat at, if they're bar placement, or even things like if I'm having certain people do squats, it might not just be for maximum weight. We might do squats, but maybe we do some tempo work, or maybe we add it in at the end of a workout, or maybe we do some different cadences with reps, 1.5 reps or 2-stop reps, or I mean, there's a number of things that we can do with it that aren't just all out, progressively overloading the squats, that still have some benefit. But in general, no, I mean, you don't have to squat. Absolutely not. There's no exercise that you have to do. You can still build legs with hack squats, leg presses, Smith machine, lunges. Are you, covering the main components of sufficient volume, progressively overloading, sufficient intensity, all those things that we were already talking about above? That's really going to be the main thing. And then obviously plenty of tension. So wherever you create the most tension is probably a good exercise for you. It's safe to say that. Last one. Adjusting training to be sport specific for physique competitors. Is this a good thing, helpful, unnecessary? So I want to make sure I understand. I think saying maybe a physique competitor that is participating in some kind of sport, perhaps. I'm not sure if that's what it's asking. Maybe I'm just maybe I'm completely butchering it, but I would say most of the time I don't alter the base of training much. I still think that there's, with athletes that I train, a lot of the time, whether they're wrestlers, I mean, I've had all kinds of uh, fighters, basketball players, whatever, literally just random sports. The base of training is still going to be very similar just because we still want to build strength, we still want to build stability, we still want to have mobility, range of motion, all of those things. I find that a lot of the sports specific stuff, the movement patterns and stuff that are involved with the sport are best practiced within the actual sport. So let's say wrestling, because I have the wrestling background. There's certain things that are common movements. You get in on a move, the way you finish it. We could probably replicate those in training, and we do want to strengthen those muscles. But I'm not going to create something really funky to try to create, just try to replicate it exactly. I would rather the person actually do it and get that practice and that muscle memory. That's going to be better. Same with basketball, same with football, same with whatever. So the base of training is probably going to be pretty similar, while the real sports specific movement patterns that I want them to learn are probably going to be more so used during their actual practice. I hope that makes sense. That's it for today, guys. My dog's barking and pissed off, so I'm going to go see what's up, and I'll talk to you guys next week.